We will open the study session. I forgot the mayor just stepped out.
You're on tap.
Okay.
And we've got Kelly Brooks and Heather Koch from NCPRD.
Some of you, well, actually, I think just Councilor Parks has seen this presentation because it came to the District Advisory Board meeting. But it is I think you'll enjoy it. It's a great update from Heather, who you've heard from a couple times in the past, just kind of where we are right now with the Milwaukie Bay Park project. One thing that's in here is some different funding strategies. A couple of those strategies are actually active right now for grants. And so we can talk about it more when we get to that piece, but I will be coming back and asking for some letters of support for 2 different programs. My plan right now is to bring those back to you all on the 17th, most likely on consent after we talk, but we'll see how you want to handle that. So that's the one piece that I just will circle back to at the end. But other than that, I was planning to hand it off to Heather to kind of walk you through where the project is right now.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Good evening, everybody. I know you're delighted to be inside on such a terrible weather evening, so thanks for being here. I'm going to flip through some of these slides fairly quickly because you guys are so familiar with the project, but it has been a while since I've been here formally, so I do want to take the time to make sure that we've kind of gone over the basics and bring you guys up to speed on anything new. But you guys are very familiar with Milwaukie Bay Park, and we have basically spent the past year really kind of preparing for the next phase, doing some work on the funding side, kind of making a plan to bring our consulting team together for the next phase. So what you're seeing today is sort of where we're heading in the next couple years and where we've been to get to this point. So today I will do a little bit of an overview of sort of how we got to where we are. And again, I'll go there pretty quickly because you guys are so familiar, but please, any questions that you have, there's plenty of time tonight for me to go back to anything. I do want to talk about the cost and funding. It's something I kind of, didn't have the luxury to go into a lot of detail on when we last presented this, as Wilda saw, to the DAB. But we have more time tonight, so I'm happy to go into any more detail. I'll talk a little bit about timeline going forward, and then next steps, and again, plenty of time for discussion. So you guys know exactly where Milwaukie Bay Park is, but I show this map because one of the really important parts about this partnership that we embarked on in 2017 is that we've really been looking at this park with sort of this dual personality as both a living room for Milwaukie and a district-wide amenity. And I think this map of the district really shows how, even though this park is on the west side of the district and on the very western edge, on the river, it is on the river. And we can't say that about much, property, Milwaukie or district-wide. So it's really become an important site, I think, for the whole district to think about a place to connect with the river, not just for river recreation or views, but sort of that more general connection with nature. And it's part of the reason why the district has so highly valued partnering with the city on this project.
And it is the only park that does have that ramp that does allow that kind of access to it.
Correct, because you have to go, you have to go quite a bit further south. There's a much more informal boat ramp down in Oak Grove.
Meldrum Bar, is that still open?
Before Meldrum Bar and near the sewage plant in Oak Grove.
Yeah, and we have River Villa Park that's also on the river, but there's not a launch there. So it's pretty unique, and as you know, it's already been heavily invested in, been being planned for, over 20 years, so there's just a lot the park has to offer, already offering, but also to offer in the future. So we've been over this too. I won't read all the bullets, but needless to say, we have a pretty wide base of policy and planning underneath us to move forward in this project. And as I've mentioned before, the Riverfront Master Plan was approved in 2010. That provided the basis for this effort since 2017-18 to go back and test and revise that design, keeping in mind the conditions of approval that had come from 2010 and some of the concerns that have evolved since then, right down to the very real and mundane issue of things like geese overriding the site, so overrunning the site. As you know, the park has really been developed in phases, and you're very familiar with these. Despite the, I would say, misfortune of having flooding in 2017 that really had an impact on the, or excuse me, 2015, that had such an impact on the bridge and the bank. The upside of that is it gave the city a really good way to do some more work that has really benefited the site. So having that new bridge, it serves the whole site because you create a bike and pedestrian connection that was not adequate before. So, you know, not planned as part of the project, but it actually enabled us to take out a special pedestrian bridge that was in the 2010 plan that would have been a very costly and difficult element of that project. And even the bank repair, you know, there's always lessons learned. The last one was probably not good timing, but even learning from the flooding events, you know, improvements could be made. And of course, the stone steps were put in that are beautiful and really define that bank so that over time, as the bank continues to fill in and grow back up, we can kind of give people an idea of where they're supposed to go down to the water instead of using the more sensitive vegetated areas. So the final schematic design is, it's very close to what you saw when I came last February. We came then and talked about the preferred alternative. We made a few tweaks and then presented it to the community in late April of 2019, and several of you were there that night. But essentially what we did, as you remember, is we had initial concepts that came from the, you know, building off the last design and doing new technical analysis, new outreach. And we gathered a lot of input, and that led us to those 3 alternatives that we had. We took those alternatives and brought them to the public, put them online on a survey, brought them to some smaller groups as well, some focus groups, and shaped the final design. And the fun part of that made it hard was, you know, we weren't picking A, B, or C. We were picking what worked in A, B, and C, and then melding it all together for the final design. It was a really good process in terms of shaping something that people really felt like addressed their concerns and provided some functional solutions. Overall, we had about 1,300 to 1,500 people engaged, which we were really happy with. That included the 3 public workshops. It included 2 online surveys, some small focus groups that I was just going to touch on in a second. And I've given these guys a shout out before, but the steering advisory committee for this project was played a big role, not just in providing feedback on the actual project and its components and bringing all the history that they had with the project, but also bringing district-wide perspective and actually guiding some of the engagement process. That committee was an unbelievable asset in connecting us to larger parts of the community and just personally volunteering. So whenever possible, I'd just like to give a shout out to that group. That included Wilda, and we're so grateful for that group's participation in this process. And we also had technical advisors, and that was really sort of a ad hoc group of mostly agency people that we would touch base with. And so they provided some point input. We'll probably tap into those same people in the next phase when things get a little more technical as we do technical refinements. This is just to point out something that we were really happy with, that we were able to take some time to have more small group discussions, because as we know, and as you guys have really experienced in your more recent planning efforts, it is very difficult to reach a very wide, broad, diverse, and deep part of the population. It's just a very true engagement takes a lot of work. And so for this phase, we did really try to hone in on some groups that we thought hadn't been as historically involved or as directly involved in this particular project. So we met with some Spanish-speaking members of the district through groups that really have largely emanated out of the North Clackamas School District in the Milwaukie area, Madres de Corazon and Padres Latinos Mustangs. Also people living with disability. We talked to tribal staff and leaders, including a really nice site visit from members of the Grand Ronde Cultural Resources team. We talked with the County Ped and Bikeways Advisory Committee. Of course, we're creating a more permanent alignment of the trolley trail, a more improved multi-use path with this final completion. So, you know, connecting with the trolley trail and doing that mindfully and reconciling conflicts is really important. So they'll probably continue to be an asset as we do technical refinements. And then also the Arts Committee. As you guys may remember, A. Adams from the Milwaukie Arts Committee was very active on our SAC and has been really helpful in making sure we keep the art part front and center in the project. So we've also gone to the Arts Committee and we'll continue to work with A and others in bringing on a public artist. So the final big public event we had, I mentioned there were 3 workshops. This final one last year was called Learn About Your Park. It was a presentation of the final design, but we also wanted to cultivate conversation around some key issues. And one was we wanted people to be able to start talking about programs and activities. It's really what people want to think about doing. You know, you can only look at the plan on a piece of paper for so long before you start thinking about, well, what do I want to do in the park and how do I want to be in that park? So we had people weigh in on things they would like to do, either with bigger events or programs and activities. And we got feedback we expected, I think, in for the most part, but I think the summary of it was people, they really just want to be in that park. They want to gather. They want to have public events. They want to use it for small group activities, large group activities, or even activities on their own. So there's plenty of desire to occupy that park and do new things that aren't as easily facilitated today. We also discussed art as a cultural interpretation, so using art, kind of helping to share with people that we were thinking about using art in a very integrated fashion in the park. There's some great examples of places where you take sculptural art and find a location for it, and in this park the emphasis since the conditions of approval have been to really think about art as an integrated component. And there's lots of examples of that regionally as well. So we tried to talk with the community about what would that mean to you? You know, it might mean transportation or commerce or Native American history or Native American present. You know, it might be about the environment and the earth. It might be about the water. So just trying to get people starting to think about that, it was really exciting because those are the meatier parts of the project that we'll get to that you're just not there yet at schematic design. So these conversations were really, I think, helpful and enlightening for us and the community. We talked a little bit about transportation and access at that meeting. Primarily because, you know, getting to the park is never going to be a slam dunk in the traditional drive up your car and park close fashion, and we've known that since the start. So really trying to engage with people about that reality, to talk about, you know, there'll be transit, there's a bike path, there's walking from a short distance if you can find, if you can become familiar with the parking strategies downtown. And we kind of mapped that out and had some conversations. And the most memorable conversation I had that night, because I spent some time at that station, was someone saying, I can't believe I can just take the bus to this park. You know, like there's just not that many parks that you can just take the bus to and get off and you're right there. And it was a parent with some children, and she was just thrilled. And I don't think she's a singular entity. You know, I think there's a lot of people who don't really think about connecting to their parks by bus. Maybe they take them to work or to their child's school, but maybe the park hasn't been easy enough. So it's exciting to think about promoting that as things move forward, as a real way of getting to the park. I mean, especially when you think about things like the solstice with thousands of people. You know, who wants to drive to that? So it's exciting to hear that conversation happening more and more. And we did have a board, I think Kelly might have stood by it, on funding a park. And that was really to convey that, you know, this takes a really big community-wide multi-partner, multi-level, multi-agency effort to fund these kind of improvements. And we just wanted to be able to talk about that with residents, and that's ongoing. So do you guys all feel pretty familiar with this schematic design? So we took all the elements and really tried to fit them all into the site in a new configuration, but really drew from that original 2010 plans in terms of the major elements like the amphitheater, the play area, the water feature, with everything tweaked a little bit. I think it's really valuable. We started in that last workshop showing more perspective drawings. And for us, this was particularly helpful because looking at those plan drawings, you can only gather so much from that, you know, flat, flyover sort of perspective. And even this, it's not ideal, but you really get to start to get a feel for the slope of the site. And that slope, the fact that this site is a true floodplain, has so much to do with what the site design is. You know, you have long meandering pathways because that's the only way you're going to get through the site if you don't want to go down a million steps. And you don't want to go down a million steps if you have any sort of mobility that's not, you know, perfect ambulation. So that dictates the site. Also, making sure that we took a lot of the more monetarily intensive investments, either for putting them in or maintaining them, like the play area and the water feature and the plaza and the terrace, taking those things and putting them further up on the site so that they weren't as likely to get inundation in the more frequent events. And so, you know, being able to see it that way, it gives you a sense of why the site is laid out the way it is. And also, I think one of the things I like that this starts to convey, at least the way I look at it, is there really is a bit of a gradation. You have an edge up near McLaughlin that does speak to the more urban environment, that speaks to the burgeoning downtown, and yet you have this really natural environment at the river where you almost feel like it's been that way forever when you get down there on the water line. So you have a more natural environment in that area, and the site, you know, tends to have that kind of gradation. So this perspective is actually, if you stand on the site to the left, which is the north of the big redwood tree, and you're up near the plaza and you sort of look down toward that blue area, which represents the water feature, you could get a view somewhat like this, where you start to depart from the plaza, come down a ramp. You would see, of course, sort of straight in the distance, a little bit of the play area. You'd start to wind around and see the water feature. And of course, you'd see the sweeping views of the park and the river. And then if you go back up in this drawing, past to the left of that tree toward McLaughlin and go out to the multi-use path, you'd have a view more like this, turning back toward the river, where you could overlook a picnic terrace. The restroom would be just to your right there. But again, really getting a sense for how up on that edge, you're really kind of looking down at these sort of vistas. And part of the long-term plan is to really develop, as we develop the construction documents, to develop a really strong management plan so that those views that have been so important to the city and the district for that matter, that we can really not just plant the site and plan the site for those views, but have the management plans that help us maintain those views.
To that point, I had a thought. One year, the Oregon Mayor's Association was in Lebanon, and they have a great little park there with a bandstand and trees, big trees around the edge, and the bandstand's clear over here. And it was one of those 101 degree days, and they had a concert for us. And everybody that came to the concert sat way out in the shade of the trees, and this whole huge empty space in front of the stage sat there empty all day because it was too bloody hot. So just thinking about that, it might make sense to have more trees interspersed in sort of the concert concept area.
Yeah, and we've talked about that. That's some of the fine tuning that we have to do with the more technical design, because you can see right there, you know, you're not going to get afternoon shade from this big one.
Nope.
You know, you're going to get morning shade from that. These you're going to get the evening shade, and at least at the start, they'll be pretty small. So trying to balance that, that desire for views with that desire for, you know, quite honestly, just comfort. It happens at, you know, there's a sister park to this park that's similar in many ways that does the same thing. People disperse right into the shade, even if they're, you know, 100 feet from the stage.
Yeah.
So that's a great point. So this doesn't have the pretty pictures, but it has a lot of important information. So I'll take a minute to go over this, and you can maybe just, you know, go back to the trees in your mind. But the timeline for the project is right now we're doing a couple things. We're refining our funding strategy and working on grant applications. And I will speak to that in the next slide a little bit. We're also working with our county procurement to work through several contracts. We'll be continuing to work with the Tuning Studio landscape architecture-led design team. But we're actually bringing on a CMGC, much like Letting Library, where you have the construction manager, general contractor come on early so that you can realize efficiencies in the design or the execution of the design and construction. So we're in the process of developing those RFPs. Right now, we are hoping to get the CMGC RFP on the street in April. We'll also be bringing on an owner's rep so we can really get the most out of that. And we'll be doing a separate contract for a public artist, but we really are trying to keep all of them on a very parallel path so that we can have all of them work together, really closely together as a team, because these pieces aren't, you can't take the art and just pull it out separately. It really has to be integrated, especially if your commitment is to integrated art. So it's a little bit of work to get it all up and running, but once we're running and we have our RFPs out, we'll be doing selection and hoping to sign contracts in June or July. That leads us into engineering and pre-construction. So this is when we start wrestling with the technical issues, making sure we are getting our permits and approvals ready. So we've done some work already with the planning department here. We had our pre-application meeting last year. We'll be doing our pre-application conference in 2020. So just kind of the progression you would expect for a project, going through all the approvals, getting our construction documents together, and very importantly, confirmation of funds. So as you may very well remember from Letting Library, you know, you really, with CMGC, the big trigger to move from your design and pre-construction and construction is setting the guaranteed maximum price. So our magical combination is we've confirmed all the funds, we get our guaranteed maximum price, we match those up, and we move forward into construction. So this timeline is reflecting our expectations for that. So that would lead us into a summer 21 start. Again, that's when we hope to authorize the construction phase, and depending on what the advice is for construction, we'd head into a 12 to 16-month construction phase, we think. A lot of that is really going to be dependent on the expertise of the CMGC. They may have some recommendations about avoiding disruption by accelerating the schedule and overlapping things that normally might be more spread out. I don't know the answer to that yet, but my expectation is that a 12 to 16-month window is going to be adequate. So it's exciting. I mean, we're kind of seeing this in our future. The biggest challenge is probably not the technical figuring out how everything fits on the site successfully. The biggest challenge to get us there is the funding. So we've worked really hard, and by we I mean NCPRD and the city. We've worked very closely, and many thanks to Kelly and Ann both for working through this so many different iterations. Our estimated cost.
It was all Kelly.
That's not true.
She's pretty amazing.
But yes, Kelly has done a tremendous amount. So the 9.6 estimated cost that you see up there is a number that should look familiar, but it's the combination of hard costs, the construction costs at 8.2 million. That was based on a cost estimate last January. And then about 1.4 in soft costs. So that's all the engineering, planning, design, it's consultant staff, et cetera, permits, approvals. And so that gives us a pretty challenging task to bring together all that funding. So obviously we're looking to every level from, you know, individuals to state and regional and federal agencies. So the way it's sketched out here is that we would be looking at using SDC Zone 1 funds. They're collected in Zone 1. We use them in Zone 1. So these, when we say potential amount, it's not because there's not a commitment there to use them, it's just because we don't know the exact amount yet. It depends both on what we collect and what we need to put out for all NCPRD projects. But there's been a very strong interest in using SDC Zone 1 funds for this project, and it fits. So we show that at 2.1 million. The city in the 7 to 19 biennium dedicated 250,000. So Kelly and I are working presently on transferring that. over to NCPRD to use in construction. And then one of the very fortunate things that happened, as you know, in November is the Metro bond passed. And so we are both looking forward to local shares. And both the city and NCPRD have to individually go through processes to approve their local shares and be in compliance and sign funding agreements with Metro. So the city's working through theirs, we're working through ours. The amounts up here are amounts we've been discussing and are subject to agency approval and determination. So we'll have some more work to do on our side. I know Kelly's probably a little further ahead than we are on your piece, but we want to get to that determination sooner than later because we will need full funding. We can't move forward with construction, obviously, with half the amount. So we'll be working on that. One of the exciting things that's happening right now that's keeping me out of trouble is the state park grants are due early in mid-April. So the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department has the Land and Water Conservation Fund. We use that for Wichita Park. And the local government grant program. And local government grant funded phase 2 work at Milwaukie Bay Park with a 2013 grant. So these are well-known entities. The project is very competitive for these funding sources. And we've done our homework, so we think that these will be a really good match for the project, and we're hoping to request $1.75 million, and that will be a reasonable award for a project of this magnitude and this level of history and support. That is what Kelly mentioned, where we would be using a letter of support from the city to show that the city is partnering on this effort. That we, as NCPRD, go to our board, the Board of County Commissioners, sitting as the NCPRD board for resolutions to apply. And then with the city letter of support, we sort of have the partnership shown to the agency that we're working on this together, especially with the complexities of the city owning the land and us planning and managing and working together to do a project of this magnitude. And then the other category, the Metro CIP grant, Kelly probably knows this much like I do. We're waiting for guidance on exactly what that program's going to look like. It was in the Metro bond. We're awaiting guidance and direction. They're still hiring for the person to administer that program. So that's probably a little ways out, but the nice thing about construction in 21 is we have some time to put together these grants and do construction within those grant windows. So we're sort of in a sweet spot where bond funds and grant funds are able to be lined up. So we just have to gather them all. No problem. And then other is a bucket that we still have to fill. We think that there could be some other grants that this project would be competitive for. There could be some other agency funds. This bucket's really to be identified. There's always a chance the project could get cheaper and we don't need the money, because that happens. I'm sure it's happened at some point in history.
Orange line recession.
Yes.
And it did happen with Metro money last time or 2 times back, because Homewood Park and Spring Park both got built in the 2009 timeframe when they got more bang for their buck than because of the.
So we have been factoring in escalation, but we don't know what the escalation is in the future, and no one can predict what's going on in the market, especially right now. So the other category is to be determined. I certainly would leave it up to you what you want to spend time talking about more tonight, but I always welcome ideas, thoughts, brainstorming on funding. One thing I don't say by name here, but Milwaukie Bay Parks Foundation has been a big supporter of Milwaukie Bay Park. They're really, still developing as an organization. They're so young, but there is a potential role that they may want to play as well. We just don't raise private funds as an agency, so that has to kind of be separate. But we are kind of turning over every stone and looking for possibilities for things that could match this project. And I think one of the promising things about that last bit is when you put these funding packages together, the more you get, the easier it can be to get the last bit, because it's so much easier not to be the first funder, right? So if we can put up some money from our agencies, which we're saying we're going to do, it makes it a lot easier for other people to partner, because then they get the benefit of a fully funded project. So my hope is that our momentum that we've already established will carry us through, but I'll always welcome any help and ideas that you have, for certain.
Didn't Good Neighbor Fund change its borders, like distance to?
No. It has not.
I thought somebody called me and told me specifically that. Maybe I'm,
Well, I sit on the committee and nothing has changed, so.
okay.
Which, I mean, that,
It still probably falls,
some part of the park
arguably, some
falls
part of the
in it.
park
Just
falls
part
within
of it,
1,000.
Yeah.
It is worth
Feet.
remembering that, sorry, I should speak into the microphone. It's worth remembering that there is a substantial portion of Kellogg Good Neighbor funds that is going to pay down debt service on
phase two.
on phase 2 of Milwaukie Bay Park. So
Yeah.
there's not as much money there as you think, and I think it's worth a discussion of whether or not all of Kellogg Good Neighbor money ought to be committed to Milwaukie Bay Park.
So two ideas, I don't know. The first one is, because the mouth of Kellogg Creek is there any potential for OWEB funding? Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, is there anything that would be?
Possibly. There's, I know that our natural areas coordinator has raised the fact that there is interest in investing in that park, particularly for cold water refugia. And so effectively my understanding, it's coming along right now, so I'm not sure how to completely describe it, but the effort, as I understand, is they would like to fund improvements in that area below our ordinary high water that we're staying out of. So there's, for example, by Klein Point, just down slope of Klein Point, the 2015 bank work is actually showing a crack right now, like a literal crack in the bank. And so there's some interest in seeing what they can do to enhance that, both for stability and habitat. So I think, I would guess that there is money through OWEB. I'm not quite sure how far upland it might go, but I think it's worth checking into to see what we might be able to do. It's definitely something I could look into.
Yeah. And the other thing is, you mentioned the Parks Foundation. I think, and you know, I know it's early to be having this, you know, but I think if there's a piece, you know, if there's a discrete piece that's sort of a public, you know, something the public will be excited about, whether that's play area or water feature, I think the Parks Foundation might be interested in trying to do some crowdfunding. We've not really done that in Milwaukie to fund anything, but I think it would be an interesting experiment to try. You know, we have some funds that we've raised, and we have some funds that we got from the past, you know, the prior efforts on the old Riverfront Park. There's about 20,000 or something, but you know, that's just something to keep in mind. I think.
Well, and there's potential for cultivating large donors if you do an approach like that, where there's something you can put your name on.
Right.
Or if
right.
you
And
wanna-
that- yeah, and that's the other thing, yeah,
Right.
to talk about is like, do you name the amphitheater? Do you name the picnic area? Do you name the whatever? And, you know, can you get a donor that way? And, you know, to the extent, I don't think that any of us on the Parks Board at this point feel like we have the necessary skill set, but we're definitely interested in trying to help, you know, help foster those conversations and help be a conduit if we can to the private, sponsorship.
I also
Absolutely.
wonder about the classic buy a brick, you know, for the plaza to help cultivate smaller donors, because those seem to work pretty well as funding mechanisms for big public projects.
Yeah, those are good ideas.
So I had a question on a non-funding, but if people had other funding stuff they wanted to talk about, I'll wait. No? So, you mentioned the bus connectivity, and, I mean, it's not far to our bus mall next to City Hall. But I wondered if there was any potential for an actual bus stop, like a pullover on 99E for a bus along the park's frontage. And, I mean, I think that would generally be good, but I also think that would be particularly good because of if this, and Kelly may have more information on this, if this frog ferry idea gets off the ground and somebody's running a ferry service down the Willamette, we want close ability for bus stops to catch the ferry or whatever.
I don't know. I haven't looked at or haven't pursued kind of additional transit investment in the form of a bus stop. I should probably be transparent about the ferry, though. So I have talked with them, and the way that it's an exciting and it's an interesting project, but the way that they're pursuing operation funds and not really looking at what investments would be needed in the dock infrastructure to make it work. At this point in time, that's not really the business they're in. It could be a future phase. So what I said, we're stretched pretty thin to get to 9.6. We're already kind of shaking the couch cushions to find another $1 million. So we don't have any additional funds. The dock is out of scope for this project in terms of making it something that you could do year-round ferry operations out of. So I would say, while yes, in an out-year situation, potentially you would have to have some transit connectivity to be able to access that. But I guess in my desired future state, I also have an undercrossing at 99E at that location that you can get over to the MAX station. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's kind of, it's more on that, probably that range. But in terms of how asking TriMet about bus access to the park and potentially even how that's not a very expensive item as they're looking at the 99 corridor more with T2020, if that's proceeding, if there's some tweaks or things that potentially we could do that would help make that more accessible, I'm happy to kind of raise that. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And I've just, by coincidence, been diving into some ODOT right-of-way delineation confusion on our maps to straighten it out in the past few days. And there is some ODOT right-of-way there. I don't know that it would be enough for like a queue jump, your classic like pull over while the other things pass, or if ODOT would entertain it. But, it's probably worth asking the question now instead of later to figure that out. Yeah. So I've alluded to this already, but I think some of our key partners in this phase are parallel to the phase in 2010, 12, 15, just looks a little different. We've got our district advisory board back in getting up to speed. We've got the city. We've got the Parks and Recreation Board that's continuing to follow the project. They, of course, sat on the steering advisory committee. Some of the steering advisory committee members are still plugged in part because they are also members of the DAB, the District Advisory Board, and we continue to have conversations with Metro. They're an important partner, not just for funding, but they've been a resource already on things like even CMGC contracting. And of course, the Milwaukie Parks Foundation is a private partner that could be really instrumental. And that graphic just shows, we have a pretty big jump with our initial funding. It's getting the rest secured in contract and grant agreements. That's our big challenge, but we're really making progress. And so next steps for the project are we're seeking the exemption for CMGC because it is alternative contracting, just like you would have had to have done here for Letting Library. We are getting our contracts together. As I said, continuing to secure funding. Once we get those contracts going, we can really dive into design development, our next phase of more technical design and construction documents, address all those things like bus queues and ODOT right-of-ways and where the trees are and whether it's for shade or views. And then obviously the permits and approvals, and primarily that is with the city. And of course, I'm here, and Catherine Krieger and Scott Archer, and we're all really behind this project at the staff level, making sure that it keeps moving, and we're here to keep you all updated. as well as other groups if you know that they're interested. So that's all I've got today.
Any questions?
It's exciting.
Yeah, so support letter will be the next thing you see. And if it's okay, I'll put it on consent. There may be an additional resolution that we need to do at some point, clarifying that the entire park is a park and is going to stay a park, just because of some remnant right away there, but I'll let you know if we need to do that.
Great. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you very much. All right. Well, that ends our study session. Time to go hang out with the cops.